My name is Natalie Mercer. I was 27 when everything changed. The first time my father called me a disappointment, he wasn't angry. That somehow made it worse. He simply stood in the kitchen, stirring his coffee while sunlight spilled across the counter, and said, "You always choose the harder road, Natalie." At the time, I laughed it off. 3 months later, I emptied nearly every dollar I had saved over 7 years and bought an abandoned gas station on the edge of town. Nobody laughed harder than my family. The property sat beside an old highway that had long been replaced by a newer route. The station had been closed since the late 1980s. The paint peeled from the walls. Rust covered the pumps. Tall weeds surrounded the building like nature was trying to erase it from memory. When I signed the purchase papers, I felt terrified. Not excited, not confident. Terrified. I remember gripping the pen so tightly my hand cramped. The seller slid the documents toward me and said quietly, "Most people only see what's falling apart." At the time, I assumed he was talking about the station. Now I think he meant something else. That evening, my parents invited me to dinner. The atmosphere felt strangely cheerful, almost rehearsed. My younger brother, Ethan, was there too. He had always been the successful one, the practical one, the one everyone trusted. When I mentioned the purchase, silence settled over the table for a moment. Then Ethan laughed. Not cruelly, just enough to make everyone else smile. "You bought that place?" he asked. I nodded. "The abandoned gas station?" "Yes." His eyebrows rose. "Why?" I opened my mouth to explain my plans. The location. The potential redevelopment, the possibility of restoring the property. But before I finished, he shook his head. "Natalie, that place is a money pit." My mother looked down at her plate. My father sighed. And suddenly I felt 12 years old again. Like I was defending every decision I'd ever made. I didn't know then that within weeks, the same property they mocked would uncover a secret hidden for decades. A secret connected to someone my family thought they knew. And someone they never truly understood. The following week felt longer than an entire year. Every morning, I drove 20 miles to the abandoned station, parked beside the rusted pumps, and spent hours cleaning decades of neglect from a place everyone else had already given up on. Most people saw decay. I kept noticing details. The way sunlight still reached the front windows every afternoon. The surprisingly solid foundation beneath the cracked concrete. The faded sign above the entrance that hinted at a different era. Sometimes I wondered if I was seeing possibility, or simply refusing to admit I had made a terrible mistake. The truth changed depending on the day. By noon, I usually felt hopeful. By midnight, lying awake in my apartment, I questioned everything. My family didn't help. Ethan had developed a habit of sending articles about failed businesses. My mother called every few days, carefully disguising concern as casual conversation. And my father rarely mentioned the station at all. His silence carried more weight than criticism. One Thursday afternoon, while sorting through old storage shelves behind the convenience store area, I found a dusty metal filing cabinet. It was wedged against a wall in a room so cluttered it looked untouched for decades. At first, I almost ignored it. Most of the station's remaining paperwork had already proven useless. Expired invoices, old maintenance records, utility statements from another century. Still, something about the cabinet caught my attention. Perhaps because, unlike everything around it, it was locked. I stared at it longer than necessary. A strange feeling settled over me. Not excitement. Curiosity. The kind that arrives quietly. The lock itself had rusted badly. After several minutes of effort, it finally gave way. The metallic click echoed through the empty building. For some reason, the sound made me uneasy. Inside were folders. Dozens of them. Neatly organized. Far more carefully preserved than anything else on the property. The names on the tabs meant nothing to me. At first, I carried several boxes into the main office and began sorting through them. Most contained property records, maps, survey documents, tax filings. Nothing extraordinary. Yet one folder stood apart from the others. Its edges were worn from repeated handling. A handwritten note was attached to the front. The ink had faded with time. I could barely read it. But one phrase remained visible. Do not destroy. I remember freezing. Outside, wind rattled the loose metal siding. Inside, the station felt suddenly smaller, quieter, as if the building itself had been waiting for someone to open that folder. I carefully unfolded the papers. The first page appeared ordinary. The second made me sit down. And by the third page, I realized I was looking at something that connected directly to my family. Not distantly. Not indirectly. Directly. The name printed across the document belonged to someone I had known my entire life. Someone whose story, according to my family, had already been fully told. But the papers in front of me suggested an entirely different truth. And that truth had been hidden behind this abandoned building for nearly 40 years. I spent the next hour reading the same pages over and over. Not because they were complicated, because they made no sense. The name on the documents belonged to my grandfather, Arthur Mercer. In my family, his story had always been simple. He had owned a small repair business, worked hard, struggled financially, and eventually passed away before I was born. That was the version repeated at every holiday gathering and preserved in old photo albums. Yet the papers spread across the desk told a different story. This gas station had once belonged to him, not briefly, for nearly 12 years. I stared at the ownership records, certain I was missing something. Why had no one ever mentioned it? Why had my grandfather owned property on the other side of town? And why had all traces of it disappeared from family conversations? The questions multiplied faster than answers. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the parking lot. The station felt suspended between past and present. I packed the documents carefully and drove home. That night, I pulled out an old cardboard box from the back of my closet. It contained photographs I had inherited after my grandmother passed away. Most were ordinary family pictures, birthday parties, picnics, graduations. Then I found one, a faded photograph of my grandfather standing beside a building. My pulse quickened. The building behind him was unmistakable. The gas station. The same front windows. The same roofline. Even the sign looked familiar. I turned the photo over. On the back, written in my grandmother's neat handwriting, were 5 words. Arthur's happiest years. I sat motionless. Growing up, I had heard countless stories about my grandfather's hardships. Never his happiest years. Never this place. For the first time, I felt something deeper than curiosity. I felt excluded, as if an entire chapter of family history had been quietly removed. The following Sunday, I brought the photograph to my parents' house. I hadn't planned a confrontation. I only wanted answers. But the moment my father saw the picture, something changed in his expression. A flicker. Small. Almost invisible. Yet impossible to miss. He recognized it immediately. "Natalie," he said carefully, "where did you find that?" The room became unusually quiet. Even my mother stopped folding laundry. I placed the ownership documents beside the photograph. "I found these at the station." No one spoke. The silence stretched longer than seemed natural. Finally, my father sat down. For the first time in my life, he looked uncertain. Not angry. Not defensive. Just tired. Ethan glanced between us, clearly confused. "What is all this?" he asked. My father rubbed his forehead. The gesture looked familiar. I'd seen it during difficult moments my entire childhood. Only now did I realize what it meant. He was deciding how much truth to reveal, and how much longer he could keep hidden. When he finally looked up, his voice was quieter than I expected. "There are things about your grandfather," he said, "that neither of you were ever told." The words settled heavily in the room. Then he looked directly at me. And what he said next would force our entire family to reconsider everything we believed about the man whose story had shaped us for generations. My father rarely spoke about the past. Even when I was a child asking questions about old photographs, he usually answered with short sentences and polite smiles. That night was different. He stared at the photograph for a long time before speaking. "The station wasn't a failure," he said quietly. The statement surprised me. For weeks, everyone had treated the property like a symbol of bad decisions and wasted opportunities. Now my father was telling a different story. My mother sat beside him, her hands folded tightly together. She looked nervous. Not the nervousness of someone being accused. The nervousness of someone carrying a secret for far too long. Then why did nobody ever mention it? I asked. Neither of them answered immediately. The clock above the dining room doorway ticked steadily. The sound seemed louder than usual. Finally, my father exhaled. Because after your grandfather died, there was a disagreement. A disagreement? He nodded. About what should happen to the business. Ethan leaned forward. I could tell he was hearing this for the first time, too. According to my father, the station had once been thriving. Travelers stopped there daily. Locals knew my grandfather by name. It wasn't merely a business. It was a gathering place. A community space. People came for fuel but stayed for conversation. For years, my grandfather had dreamed of expanding the property and building something larger behind the station. Then his health declined unexpectedly. The plans were never completed. After his death, the family struggled financially. Arguments followed. Relationships fractured. And eventually, the station was sold. At least that was the official story. But as my father spoke, I noticed something strange. Certain details seemed carefully chosen, edited, as though parts of the truth were still missing. The same feeling returned when he reached the end of the story. An unfinished sentence hidden inside a finished one. When I pointed toward the folder I had found, my father immediately looked away. That reaction told me more than his words. There was something in those documents he wasn't ready to discuss. Something larger than an old business dispute. That night, after returning home, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I opened the folder again. This time I examined every page, every handwritten note, every map, every receipt. Near the bottom of one stack, folded between two property surveys, I found something I had overlooked before. An envelope. Thin. Yellowed with age. Sealed. Across the front, in faded handwriting, was a message. Not a name. Not an address. Just 6 simple words. For whoever finally asks why. I stared at the envelope for several seconds. A chill moved through me. The room was silent. The city outside my apartment had gone dark. And somehow, holding that forgotten envelope felt more significant than finding the ownership records themselves. Someone had expected questions. Someone had anticipated that decades later, another person would come searching for answers. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the envelope over. The seal remained intact, untouched, waiting, for nearly 40 years. And somehow, it had been waiting for me. I didn't open the envelope right away. For nearly 2 days, it sat on my kitchen table. Every time I walked past it, I felt its presence. That sounds ridiculous now, but it's true. Some objects carry weight beyond what they are. A wedding ring, a handwritten letter, a photograph tucked inside an old book. This envelope felt like one of those things. Part of me wanted answers immediately. Another part feared what those answers might change. By Saturday morning, curiosity finally won. I made coffee, sat by the window, and carefully broke the aging seal. Inside was a letter. Only 3 pages long. Written entirely in my grandfather's handwriting. I recognized it from old birthday cards my grandmother had saved. The first line stopped me cold. If you're reading this, then someone finally cared enough to look deeper. I read the sentence twice. Then 3 times. The letter wasn't addressed to a specific person. It felt more like a conversation with the future. My grandfather explained that the station had never simply been a business. Years before his death, he had discovered something unusual about the property. Not hidden treasure. Not anything dramatic. Something far more valuable. Opportunity. Behind the station sat several acres of undeveloped land connected to an old transportation corridor that local officials had quietly been studying. According to the documents he included, long-term infrastructure plans suggested that development would eventually return to the area. Most people couldn't see it. He could. He believed the land would one day become significantly more valuable than the station itself. But that wasn't the real surprise. The final page revealed why he had kept everything secret. He feared that if the information became known too early, Family members would fight over ownership instead of preserving the property's future. Reading those words felt strangely painful, not because they criticized anyone, because they sounded accurate. I thought about years of family tension, unspoken comparisons, financial disagreements, old resentments hidden beneath polite conversations. My grandfather had seen those cracks long before anyone else admitted they existed. Attached to the letter was another document, a legal memorandum, signed and notarized. I stared at the date, then checked it again. The document outlined rights connected to portions of the undeveloped land behind the station. Rights that had never been transferred during the original sale. Rights that still appeared legally attached to the property. My heart raced. Surely it couldn't be that simple. Surely decades of ownership changes would have erased something so important. Yet the paperwork seemed legitimate, complete, carefully preserved. Suddenly, the abandoned station looked different in my mind. Not because of money, because of purpose. For the first time, I understood why my grandfather had called those years his happiest. He hadn't merely built a business. He had built a vision. And somehow, through a chain of forgotten documents and decades of silence, that vision had found its way back to me. What I didn't realize was that someone else was about to learn the truth as well. And their reaction would change the entire family dynamic forever. The first person I showed the documents to wasn't my father. It was a property attorney. I needed facts before emotions. For too long, my family had relied on assumptions, half-remembered stories, and carefully edited memories. If I was going to understand what my grandfather had left behind, I wanted certainty. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. By the end, the attorney removed his glasses and sat quietly for a moment. That pause told me everything. There may be something significant here, he said. Not certainty, not promises, but enough to confirm I wasn't imagining things. Over the next several weeks, surveys were reviewed, records were requested, and old filings were examined. The process moved slowly, forcing me to be patient. Meanwhile, the station continued to occupy my days. I cleaned, repaired, organized. Little by little, the property began looking less abandoned. Neighbors started stopping by. Some remembered my grandfather. Others remembered the station itself. An elderly man named Walter stood beside the old pumps one afternoon and smiled. "Your grandfather used to sit right over there," he said, pointing toward a weathered bench. "He always believed this place had a future." The words stayed with me, because they echoed what I'd read in the letter. Eventually, the attorney called. I knew something important had happened the moment I heard his voice. Several historical records supported my grandfather's claims. More importantly, portions of the undeveloped land behind the station had become increasingly valuable due to recent regional development plans. The forgotten corridor my grandfather had studied decades earlier was finally attracting serious attention. I sat in silence after the call ended, not celebrating, just absorbing it. For years, my family had viewed the station as evidence of failure, a mistake, a cautionary tale. Now the facts suggested something entirely different. A week later, my parents and Ethan came to see the property. For the first time, they walked through the station without jokes or skeptical smiles. They listened as I explained what had been discovered. The documents, the letter, the historical records, the future possibilities. When I finished, nobody spoke immediately. Ethan looked across the land stretching behind the building. His expression wasn't defensive. It was thoughtful, almost regretful. Then he said something I never expected to hear. I should have listened before I laughed. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't part of a grand apology. That's why they mattered. For years, I had wanted validation. Standing there, I realized something surprising. I didn't need it anymore. The station had already given me something more valuable. It had revealed a truth hidden beneath decades of assumptions. And that truth wasn't just about land. It was about how easily families inherit stories without ever questioning whether they're complete. Still, one final conversation remained. A conversation that had been waiting for years. And it would force my father to reveal the part of the story he had never told anyone. A few days after my family visited the station, my father called and asked if we could talk alone. Not at the house. Not over the phone. At the station. The request surprised me. My father had spent most of his life avoiding difficult conversations. If something hurt, he buried it beneath work, routine, and silence. The afternoon he arrived, the sky was overcast. The station looked different now. Fresh paint covered the front walls. The windows reflected soft gray light. The weeds that once swallowed the property had been cleared away. For the first time in decades, the place looked cared for. My father stood quietly near the old bench Walter had pointed out. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed. "You remind me of him." I knew immediately who he meant. My grandfather. The man whose story seemed to grow larger with every piece of truth I uncovered. My father sat down and stared toward the open land behind the building. When I was younger, I thought he cared more about this place than he cared about us. The confession caught me off guard. There was no bitterness in his voice, only honesty. He explained that during the final years of my grandfather's life, money was tight. Stress affected everyone. Dreams that once seemed exciting started feeling risky. My father had wanted stability, predictability. My grandfather kept talking about possibilities. Eventually, those differences became arguments, not explosive ones. The kind that slowly create distance between people who love each other. When my grandfather died, my father carried that unresolved frustration for years. The station became a symbol of it. So did the unfinished plans. So I stopped talking about it, he admitted. It was easier than facing how much I misunderstood him. The words settled heavily between us. For the first time, I saw the story through his eyes. Not as a villain or a victim, just a son who had lost his father before either of them found common ground. The silence that followed felt different from the silences I remembered growing up. This one wasn't hiding anything. It was making room for truth. My father reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a small object. A brass key, worn smooth by time. "I found this after your grandmother passed away," he said. "She told me it belonged here." I turned the key over in my hand. Attached was a faded tag. 3 words were still visible. Future Expansion Office. I looked toward the rear of the property, toward a small structure hidden behind trees that I had barely noticed during months of cleanup. Suddenly, another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. My grandfather hadn't only left documents. He had left intentions, plans, dreams. And somehow, after decades of silence, our family was finally beginning to understand them. What happened next wouldn't bring riches overnight. It wouldn't transform life into a fairy tale, but it would bring something far more meaningful. A chance to rewrite a family story that had been built on misunderstanding for nearly 40 years. The small building behind the station turned out to be exactly what the faded tag suggested. An office. Or, at least, what had once been one. The structure was modest, weathered wood, dusty windows, and a door that resisted opening until I finally used the brass key my father had given me. When the lock clicked, I felt the same strange sensation I had experienced when opening the filing cabinet weeks earlier. Not excitement. Recognition. As though I was stepping into a conversation that had started long before I arrived. Inside, the room was surprisingly organized. A desk. Several shelves. A corkboard covered with yellowed maps. And on the far wall, pinned beneath a layer of dust, was a hand-drawn development plan. My grandfather's plan. Road access routes. Community gathering areas. Small business spaces. A cafe. A local market. Notes written in the margins. Ideas. Dreams. Possibilities. Nothing extravagant. Nothing designed to make someone wealthy overnight. Instead, it reflected the same thing neighbors had described again and again. He hadn't wanted to build an empire. He had wanted to build a place where people felt connected. Standing there, I finally understood why the station had meant so much to him, and why losing it had left such a complicated mark on my family. Months later, after legal reviews and careful planning, I organized a gathering at the property. Neighbors came. Former customers came. My parents came. Even Ethan arrived early to help set up chairs. The evening sun painted everything in warm gold light. People shared stories, laughed, remembered. For the first time, the station felt alive again. Near sunset, my father stood before the crowd and spoke briefly. He admitted that for years he had told an incomplete story. Not intentionally, just painfully. He had focused on disappointment and forgotten hope, on unfinished plans and overlooked the vision behind them. The apology wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. The truth itself was enough. Later, after everyone left, I sat alone on the old bench. The same bench where my grandfather had once watched travelers come and go. The property was quiet. A soft breeze moved through the trees. Lights from the restored station glowed gently behind me. I thought about the day I signed the contract. The laughter, the doubt, the feeling of being dismissed before anyone understood what I saw. Back then, I thought success meant proving people wrong. Now I understood something different. The greatest victory wasn't uncovering hidden documents, or valuable land, or forgotten plans. It was breaking a cycle of misunderstanding. It was giving truth a chance to breathe. My family had called me a failure for buying a rundown gas station. In the end, they stopped laughing for a reason none of us expected. Because hidden behind that building wasn't fortune. It was perspective. And sometimes, the most valuable thing we inherit isn't property at all. It's the opportunity to finally see one another clearly. Sometimes the greatest discoveries aren't hidden in old buildings, forgotten documents, or pieces of land. They're hidden in the stories we've been told, and the truths we've never questioned. What began as a purchase everyone mocked became a journey that healed old wounds, revealed long-buried truths, and reminded an entire family that understanding is more valuable than judgment. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more powerful family stories. And tell us in the comments, have you ever uncovered a truth that completely changed how you saw your family or your past? We'd love to hear your story.